So you've thought a little bit about the story that you would share. And we're going to get into, maybe you would call it, the psychology of why you've specifically chosen that story. Because while it may be an important story to you and you may feel like that you have neutrally chosen that story, I'm willing to bet that subconsciously, at least, if not consciously, the context of which in which you would be presenting this and the audience had some effect on the story that you chose. So let's think a little bit about the video you watched that's an advertisement. It's an advertisement for a department store. And so the connection's not immediately clear. If you were creating an advertisement to get people to buy more products from your department store, because let's be honest, as emotional or as great and compelling as that video may be, that's the primary purpose of this advertisement. You may not think about creating a story about a little boy who receives a piano and then grows up to become famous and to fulfill kind of his life's desires and wishes through that piano that was purchased for him as a kid. But because it's a compelling story, then it makes you as the buyer think that it's worth spending a little bit more money on these gifts that you're giving on the front end, because you never know the long-term impact that they're going to have. So it's kind of a tricky way of getting you to think about what the gifts you're giving mean to the people that you're giving them to, and then how that should affect your purchasing on the front end. So we see an example, a perfect example of how a story is used to compel an audience to action. Now, I asked you to choose a story that you would tell that best represents who you are as an individual. And I suggested a minute ago that you actually, in choosing that story, probably chose a specific story that represents you in a way that you want to be perceived by the audience that you're telling this story to. In the case of the example I just gave, the example of a student presenting or introducing themselves to a classroom of fellow students and to a professor. And so whether you recognized it or not, or whether you consciously thought about the audience or not, that had some type of impact upon the way that you told this story, or the way you would have told this story, and the specific story that you chose as well. So I want us to think a little bit about this question. Do we all only have one story? So that question that I just posed to you of tell one story that represents you as a person, is there only one story that you could have told? Is there only one story in your life that represents who you are as an individual? Or are there many different stories of who you are and how each of those stories represents something about you as an individual? And so when we're thinking about writing a personal statement, whether we're telling it in a story format and actually walking through characters and plots and all of those things, which we're most likely not in a genuine personal statement, but we're still crafting a narrative about who we are as an individual, what's important to us, and what we've accomplished in our past. So it's important to think about how we're telling that story. Obviously, my answer to this question of do we only have one story is no, that each of us has multiple and myriad stories that we could tell about ourselves and our skill set. So to illustrate this, if I was to change this question slightly, and if I was asking you to introduce yourself to a group of people by telling a story that illustrates your ability as a leader, tell a story that illustrates your role as a student, tell a story that illustrates how your faith is put into action, or that demonstrates how important family is to you, or your particular view of family. If I was to put a purpose at the end of that story and ask you to specifically choose a story that illustrates these things, you would choose a specific story, maybe most likely even a different story than the previous story that you chose, because an explicit purpose has been given to you. The person posing the question has told you exactly what they want to know about you, and they want a story that illustrates that for you. So you can choose a different story simply by thinking about what the purpose of the story that you're telling is. To illustrate how you are a leader, you would choose probably a quite different story than how you are a student, how you study well alone, or how you practice, how you memorize information in the room, or how you put it into action. Whereas where you're a leader, you would be talking about your interpersonal skills and the actions that you take to lead others. If we talked about faith, you would highlight your past religious actions. If we talked about your family, you would talk about the specific stories that illustrate the relationships that you had with others. So by thinking about the purpose of your story, you change the story that you're telling. Now, the other tricky part of this in thinking about stories is that you're not only telling a specific purpose, putting a specific purpose with your narrative, but you're actually crafting that narrative for an audience. So if we were again to tweak this specific question that we posed a minute ago and to ask you to tell a story about how you are a leader that demonstrates your ability to be a leader, but we were to add a specific audience. So we were to say, introduce yourself to church members by telling a story, or introduce yourself to a hiring manager, or introduce yourself to an admissions committee. The audience that's stated in each of these questions would change the way that you not only think about the story that you would tell, but also the way that you would think about leadership. A hiring manager at a small business may be looking for a quite different form of leadership than church members are looking for when they're asking you about your leadership abilities. And the same goes as well for admissions committees or any type of grant that you're applying for. So it's important not only to think about the purpose of your personal statement, but also to think about the audience. Now, where this gets a little bit tricky is that often the purpose and the audience are not explicitly stated in the prompt. Sometimes the purpose is given generically, of simply introduce yourself and tell important and relevant information about yourself. But many times the actual purpose of what they're wanting you to do and the audience are not explicitly stated. And so it's up to you as the writer and the creator of this personal statement to create this audience in your mind, and not just any fictional audience, but specifically the audience that you anticipate will be reading this personal statement. And then also to think about the purpose. What is it that they are looking for in a candidate? What is it that they want and value as an institution? And then to think about how you can tell a story about yourself that illustrates your value to that group.